So what are the tenets of Marxism that were brought in? Can you kind of walk me through the broad overview of the book?
Sure. Marx wrote a lot, and I think if you were to ask somebody what is Marxism, you would get as many answers as people you asked. The same with liberalism or conservatism. These political labels are incredibly slippery. There's no single definition necessarily. And when you're asking someone, it really depends on sort of time and perspective. But I'll tell you what I think Marxism is, which is not which does not mean that Marxism, this is the Marxism everyone agrees with. And across U.S. history, when people in the United States embraced Marxism or tried to put Marx's ideas into use in the United States, they meant different things, perhaps. But at its core, Marxism is a theory about history, and that is that the things driving history tend to be material. That is, humans and their relationship to economic production. Marx firmly believed that that was like the main driving force of history, and capitalism in particular, he argued, was an economic system predicated on labor value. That is, like, the value in capitalism comes from people who work to create things. And this was the problem he saw. So in a way, Marx celebrated capitalism because it had overturned lots of older traditions like feudalism that he thought were highly oppressive. And he also celebrated capitalism because it brought lots of people together in highly productive ways. But he believed that the problem with capitalism was that it was predicated on the exploitation of the working class, in the sense that somebody works for, let's say, 10 hours, and they have to work for 10 hours because they have to sell their labor in order to survive. During that 10 hours, they might actually have only needed to work for 4 hours to create enough value for their own subsistence, but the other 6 hours is profit to the person who is paying their wages. And that's the sort of understanding of capitalism premised on the exploitation of labor that's central to Marxism.
Okay, let's talk about that a little more. But first, I want to ask, how did that? So that was his view about capitalism and labor. What did that translate to as far as action items or things that happened in the U.S.?
So the earliest Marxist parties emerged in the 1870s, the Working Men's Party of the United States, which was largely formed by German immigrants. And then you saw the emergence after that of the Socialist Labor Party in the 1880s. And then by the early 20th century, you get the Socialist Party of America with Eugene Debs as their leader. And I would argue all of them are operating on the Marxist principle that what is best for society is if the working class has more power, has political power. And the best way to obtain that is to organize both at the level of the point of production, which is when you get the formation of unions. If the working class has power over production, that's going to be a better, more democratic society, because in a capitalist society, people spend so much of their time, so much of their lives at work. And if they're selling their labor under conditions of exploitation, and if they don't have sort of control over the workplace, over the sort of quality of work, then they're going to, their existence is not going to be very pleasurable. They're not going to be able to thrive. And that, for Marx, was not a democratic way of acting. And so that was that was the sort of core understanding of Marxism in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so people formed these political parties in order to both gain political power, sometimes win elections. The Socialist Party of America elected several people, including people to Congress from the state of Wisconsin. The Socialist Party had its largest membership numbers in the state of Oklahoma during the early 20th century. So the Socialist Party truly was a national party. And that was kind of they were firmly in the belief that they needed a party and they needed to work within labor unions in order to create more working class power, as against the sort of emergence of capitalist power in the time period, which you could see take shape in the big corporations that had come to control most of the American economy during the late 19th and early 20th century.
What did he mean by the working class? Can you kind of define what that term means?
Sure. So famously in the Communist Manifesto, with which Marx mostly wrote himself, but with his longtime collaborator Frederick Engels, published in 1848, he outlines his sort of historical thoughts on capitalism, and he argued that out of the many classes from the feudalist society, people were being thrown into one of two classes: the bourgeoisie, which is famously the capitalist class. Those are the people who own the means of production, and thus those are the people who hire everyone else to work for them. And then the proletariat, that's the working class. And so the working class for Marx is simply just people who have to work for wages, work for a salary, people who have to sell their labor in order to survive, people who don't own the means of production, who don't own like land and factories and railroads, people who don't own things, so they have to work in order to survive. It doesn't really matter what they're doing, but the working class are people who have to work in order to make a living.
And why did he see that as an ill that needs to be a problem that needs to be solved?
Well, to go back to the early argument, precisely because it was a system predicated on exploitation. So he makes this case in Capital, especially Volume 1 of Capital, which was published in 1867. It's a lengthy analysis predicated on his lengthy studies of the working class factory system in England, but also on his studies of capitalism in the United States, including the Civil War. And he argued it was a system of exploitation, and that capital, the sort of logic of capital was one of expansion, expanding profits, expanding its sort of political and economic reach, to the detriment of the working class. And so he made the case that the working class, the more they worked, the more that capital accumulated, the more capitalists profited, and the less the working class thrived. So he saw it as a system of exploitation, and that humans, in order to sort of create a society that was not about exploitation, had to overcome capitalism, had to move into the next phase of history.
I'd be interested to see how he defined, and potentially how you define as well, exploitation, because in the broad expansion of capitalism, I don't know that I would agree that because the people, the CEOs and the people in the boardroom get richer, everyone else gets poorer. I mean, if you look at I think it's over the past 50 years, according to the UN, a majority of, maybe not a majority, I don't know the exact percentage, but a large percentage of the world has moved out of poverty, according to UN standards, because of capitalism, because of the capitalist businesses that are allowed to thrive.
Yeah, I don't agree with that sort of take on UN figures.